astrology is a language, and it has its own grammatical rules, and it has its own alphabet, and you know, we inevitably have to begin there. We have to begin with looking at all these different symbols. And when we look at them one by one, it's very disconnected. You know, you don't yet have a context for these ideas. You know, I'm just going to be telling you a whole lot of things. So bear in mind that what can initially seem a little bit dull almost, eventually becomes interesting when the different little bits are pieced together. But we have to necessarily break it apart into little bits at first. But this is, you know, in this, when we break it apart like this, we don't see its livingness. But okay, now the diagram you have before you is a typical example of a Western astrological birth chart, a round wheel, and you'll see that these various different types of categories of symbol are pointed out here. And these are basically the primary groupings, if you like, of astrological symbols. Planets, signs, houses, and aspects. There are other things in astrology, but these are the primary ones. With these, you know, 99% of astrological interpretation happens by combining and weaving together these different symbols. So you can see this is the aim of this particular slide is just to show you around an astrological chart if you're not already familiar with that. So you can see the planets are here, and you can see there's these little numbers there connected with them, which is basically showing their positions in the zodiac. And there you have the signs of the zodiac. It's pretty straightforward. Now, incidentally, you have 360 degrees in a circle. And if we divide that by 12, we get 30 degrees each. So basically each sign of the zodiac occupies 30 degrees. And so in the wheel as you see it here, the sequence is always anti-clockwise. So, for example, here we have Pisces. You see, and it will begin over here where Pisces meets Aquarius. So that'll be 0 degrees, 5, 10 is about 1/3 of the way through, 15 is halfway through, up until 29, and then begins with 0 degrees of the next sign. Okay, so it's 0 to 30 with each sign going in this anti-clockwise direction. Okay. And by the way, have you ever wondered why there are 360 degrees in a circle and not some other number? I think we could take it as a given that the 360 degrees in a circle are related to the fact that there are almost 360 days in a year. So basically the sun's movement is very connected to this degree division in a circle. This is why the sun will move 1 degree per day. But now, so you have 12 signs of the zodiac, each occupying 30 degrees. Okay, and then 1 degree equals 60 minutes. It's composed of 60 minutes. And here, minutes has nothing to do with time. It is 1/60th of a degree. So you can see here in this diagram here, we have Pluto in Taurus at 24 degrees and 43 minutes. So, you know, generally speaking, planetary positions in the zodiac are given in degrees and minutes. If we had to do away with the minutes altogether, it would still give us a very generally usable level of accuracy. So the minutes are really just a fine-tuning. We're really interested in the degrees primarily. All right. Now, later on we'll go into what the zodiac really is in a little bit more detail. So this is just a brief overview. Houses. In the context of what we're going to be focusing on in this course, houses will not feature very prominently. We will not be using houses a great deal. You can see here that the ascendant starts, was marked, shown on the left hand side, and this left arm, if you like, of a Western chart is always where you will find the ascendant, and the ascendant being the particular point in the zodiac on the eastern horizon at the specific time and place of birth. Now, from that point, the space around the Earth is divided into 12 sections, and these are known as the houses. So you'll see the first house will always begin here underneath the ascendant on the left of a Western chart. Now that's the simple version. There are actually many different schools of thought regarding precisely which astronomical or geographical criteria you should use to make this division. But so there are different house systems, but generally this is the concept, and basically the horizontal line that you have here in this chart, the ascendant on the left and the descendant on the right, that is literally the horizon. So everything in the top half of this wheel is visible, is above the horizon. Everything below is literally below the horizon and therefore not visible. So you can see the moon there is below the horizon, sort of bottom right. We can see that this is the chart of Einstein. We can see here that he was born at 11:30 a.m. So that's why the sun is right. There's the sun. It's high up. The midheaven is shown there. I know it's at a bit of an angle in relation to the eastern horizon, not quite 90 degrees. The reasons for that is a little complicated, but so basically the houses are a similar thing to the zodiac. The first house corresponds to the first sign, Aries, the second house to Taurus, the third house to Gemini. The houses are the same thing as the zodiac, but just on a different octave and using different astronomical criteria. The same symbols, the same archetypal concepts are used with both the signs and the houses. And in all cases, this archetypal symbol structure, for want of better words, which is the zodiac or the houses, is just projected from some sort of meaningful beginning point. And these words I've just uttered now are actually quite important. This idea that there is a projection of the symbol structure from a meaningful beginning point. Even if you right now don't consider that very important, it might be something to reflect on again in future, because we'll see that the same concept then can be applied in many different ways. It might not seem important now. Okay, but just to sum up, the houses are basically a division of the space around the Earth into 12 not always equal sections, unlike the zodiac actually. But this is not primarily important in this course. In the context of Vedic astrology, I use the houses a lot more. But now you can see the final grouping of symbols, component in the astrological alphabet is the aspects, and these are these geometric lines you can see in the center of this chart. You can see there this red line here showing that Jupiter and Uranus were in a opposition, which is a 180-degree angle. These blue lines here are generally, these solid blue lines in this diagram are showing trines or 120-degree angles. And so basically these geometric angles or aspects formed between the planets are almost, I'd like to think of them sometimes as like telephone wires of sorts. They're channels along which communication can occur, and mutual influence can occur. And aspects, in my opinion, are the most reliable principle in Western astrology. And Western astrology uses aspects sometimes in very precise ways compared to Vedic astrology. And so I'm really encouraging you to give aspects a lot of attention. If you already do astrology, to give them more primary attention, and if you have not already studied astrology, the aim of this course is to get you to begin as soon as possible working with aspects. And I'm actually often quite surprised at how people who've done a fair amount of astrology are sometimes a little weak on aspects. It's the last thing you want to be weak on in terms of your mastery of different astrological techniques. Now, it's important to realize that with astrology we are really studying our solar system. We are studying other heavenly bodies beyond our solar system. We do look at stars and things like that. But we're primarily looking at our solar system and at the planets in our solar system. So to study astrology is to become a lot more intimately familiar with the solar system and with the cycles of the planets in the solar system. And therefore, the study of the planets themselves is really very primary. Of all those different groupings of symbols that we just looked at, the planets are arguably the most fundamental factors, the key core components in the language. You could, for example, in my opinion, do fairly good astrology using the planets alone with geometric angles without having signs and houses. And there are certain systems of astrology that work very much that way and that tend to use the zodiac only as a means of measuring the angles. So you know, the planets represent or are associated with very basic faculties in us. And the basic axiom of astrology is that the microcosm is a replica of the macrocosm. You are a miniature solar system. And this is a very profound fact, and it's something that you can become very intimately familiar with through studying astrology. It can become a very real fact for you that there is this dance occurring between you and the solar system, and that your personal evolution is happening in sync with the solar system. And again, one of the things that this course is intended to teach you is how to work with what are known as transits, which is a method for looking at how the planets in their current positions are affecting your birth chart and the results of that. That reveals very vividly this dance that there is all the time between us and the solar system. And in a sense, the fact that we're a little solar system, in a sense, explains why we can hear the big solar system, if you like. So, each planet represents specific functions and faculties within a person. This is very important. There are different systems of psychology out there that have attempted, as I understand it, to map the human psyche and to map the functions in a human being, the different drives and faculties in a human being. And it's appropriate for such systems to try and do this, to try and create a map that helps one to see in an objective way what makes us tick and what we're comprised of. Even if astrology didn't work in the mysterious and magical way that it does, in the way the symbolism of the planets in psychological terms helps us to map the different faculties and functions and drives of a person, would make it worth studying for that reason alone. So, we need, in order to be truly functional in the fullest sense of the word, we need to have all these different faculties and functions working effectively. And an astrological birth chart helps us to gain insight into which drives and faculties are working optimally and which are not. So a planet's condition and capacity to function is affected by sign placement, house placement, and aspects from other planets. In other words, when we look at an astrological birth chart and we consider all the factors that will affect a certain planet, its environment by sign, by house, and other influences onto that planet, it tells us a lot about the way in which a certain functional faculty is operating and whether or not it's able to express itself in a normal way, and in an effective way, in a useful way. And it's because not everybody was given the same hand, so to speak, that some people do find it much more natural and easy and automatic to express certain character traits than other people. Some people are naturally courageous, and other people have to work harder at it. Some people are naturally generous, and other people have to work harder at it. Some people are naturally melancholy, other people not. And these idiosyncrasies are very much deducible by looking at the state of planets. And okay, when we apply a planet when we look at analyze a planet in the context of the birth chart, we note that it will influence areas of life associated with the signs and houses it is located in, and also the areas of life associated with other planets it forms aspects to. Like I said before, these basic symbols, planets, signs, houses, and aspects, all sort of interweave in fluent astrological interpretation. But now I want to give you a description of what I understand to be something like the mechanism whereby astrology works. I'll try and be brief about it. But you've heard of chakras. You've heard that we have these energy centers. Some people seem to think we have more than others do. In other words, according to certain paradigms, there are more than 7. Classically speaking, there are 7 chakras. Well, there are 7 major chakras and several minor chakras in different places. The word chakra literally means wheel. And the chakras are said to be these spinning vortices in certain parts of the body. I'm sure you've heard this. And what's important to note, though, is that each one of those chakras is associated with certain drives and faculties. And there's the key point, because that is the same as the planets. And if you look at the planets in the solar system, they are also chakras. They are literally wheels. They are literally spinning vortices. And the whole solar system is a wheel. That's probably, well, not just probably, according to certain mystics, our solar system is one of 7 solar systems, which could be compared to the 7 chakras in the body of a great cosmic being. You may or may not believe that, and it may or may not be literally true, but it certainly is very accurate as an analogy of sorts, in the way the macrocosm and microcosm tend to reflect each other, and the way the same pattern tends to repeat itself in different places in the universe. But okay, so we've got we've got these 7 chakras in our body, these 7 major chakras in our energy fields, rather, and we also have these minor chakras. Now, and then we notice that the planets in the solar system are also like so many chakras. Now, when a person is born, you remember that first diagram we looked at, this is Einstein's chart, incidentally. We have all these different planets located in different degrees. You see here we've got Venus at 16 degrees Aries, for example. And what we could say that the 360 degrees of the zodiac are like so many keys on a grand piano. And as the planets move through the zodiac, through 1 degree at a time, it's as if they are sending out a certain vibration or frequency of that particular zodiac degree. And if we accepted that each planet in the birth chart has a correspondence to a certain chakra in the energy system, then it could be said that that degree of the zodiac a given planet occupied in your birth chart, in a sense, corresponds to a particular musical note, a particular type of vibrational frequency. And so, like a tuning fork is set at a certain pitch, you can have a bunch of tuning forks and each one can be set at a different note. Our chakras become like tuning forks, set permanently at certain precise pitches based on the zodiac positions of the planets at the time of our birth. And in future, we will respond when we are exposed to frequencies or vibrations that resonate with that particular vibration or tone. So when the planets move along after your birth and they move through the zodiac, when they arrive at degrees of the zodiac where they send forth a pitch or tone or note that resonates with those that your chakras were set at birth, that's when you respond. Just one moment. So that was a very sort of sketchy, imperfect description, but maybe it gives you some idea of the kind of mechanism behind, some suggestion of a type of mechanism that is behind the way we are affected by the planets. And if you look at it that way, it also should remove the fatalism people often approach astrology with, or perceive in astrology, because basically what through our chakras, which are these subtle energy batteries of sorts that can attract and repel other things in this world, through them to a large degree we're creating our experience and engaging with our environment. So the things that happen to us under different astrological cycles are largely a result of the way our energy fields are stimulated. Now, this might have a whole fresh reality for you once you've looked at transits for a while. You know, then this analogy of mine might be more believable. Not that I think it's unbelievable necessarily, but it's more obvious that it's somewhat true when you've actually looked at transits for a while. And some people have created speculative systems of correspondence between planets and chakras. And this is a diagram from a book that presents one such method for converting a birth chart into a type of chakra graph. It can be quite evocative in a way to look at it this way. It might not be literally true, but it's an interesting way of doing it. I won't go into this in detail now, but it is an interesting thing. For example, if you had planets in Aquarius in your birth chart, then they would affect the base chakra along with, see, the Saturn ruled signs. Planets in the Saturn ruled signs would be there, you know. Planets in Cancer or Leo would be in, you know, in the head, in the third eye, and so on. But that's just a hint regarding at least the theory of it, of how it could actually potentially be applied in practice if one had the correspondences right. And this may be a true correspondence. It's, in this particular system, you can see Saturn is at the bottom. And then Jupiter, and then Mars, and then Venus, and then Mercury, and then Sun, Moon, and that's kind of the order you find them in the solar system, and it sort of makes sense. I don't explore it in more detail here because I'm not 100% sure it's an absolutely correct way of looking at it, but it's interesting. Okay, now we're going to start getting into a closer analysis of the planets And although each of the planets will have their own or its own set of associations and meanings, the planets are also grouped and categorized in various ways that are quite important and that help us to understand them. And, our interpretation can often be built around knowing these classifications. So they're quite important to understand. The most basic way in which the planets are grouped would be in terms of what we could call, I suppose, gender. The Moon and Venus are feminine. The Sun and Mars are masculine. So what this means is that the Moon and Venus will represent femininity as a, I suppose, abstract concept, and as an idea that can describe certain types of drives within us, and of course we can have those drives whether or not we're female. I suppose you could call them nurturing, caring, softer sort of energies. And those are the ones that the Moon and Venus represent, whereas the Sun and Mars are more fiery both, and they tend to represent energies that are somewhat more aggressive, somewhat harsher, but also very energized, very lively, and very alert. So the masculine planets have a lot to do with our self-assertion in the world, our ambitions, I suppose. The Moon and Venus are more about feeling, maybe even to some degree more about awareness then, and perception and response. Mercury is androgynous, and that's an interesting thing about Mercury. Mercury is quite unique in that way, in that Mercury it can engage with everything, but is its only real attribute is that it is versatile and clever, really. And in the planetary family, the Sun and Moon would be the father and mother, the king and queen. Mars and Venus would be something like a young man and a young woman in the prime of their life, bursting with sexual vitality, libido. And that's why Venus and Mars as a pair have a lot to do with these very basic drives, very basic life force, basic creative urges. But Mercury is like the child in the planetary family that has not yet gone into puberty, so to speak, so that there isn't really a very conscious or awakened connection with sexuality, for want of better words, or with gender polarity. But on another level, Mercury is both. Mercury represents the ability to integrate things and to, I suppose, make connections between things. So there's different levels on which this, or at which the symbolism can be read. Venus and the Moon can literally represent women. If we are having Moon or Venus transits, for example, there's a very good chance that we will experience the relevant energies that are connecting to the Moon and Venus via women. Likewise, with the Sun and Mars, they literally can represent men. And when we look at Mercury in that context, Mercury would represent children, perhaps, or people who are somewhat asexual in their energy, people who are very intelligent and communicative and not distinctly very yang or yin. Mercury is also mythologically the winged young god. So Mercury is it's all about the lively curiosity of youth. But actually, I just want to go back to the previous slide. There's something else I want to say about this particular grouping of planets beyond the division into masculine and feminine gender. That is that these 5 planets, the Sun, the Moon, Venus, Mars, and Mercury, are what are sometimes collectively known as the personal planets. Our basic personalities are created by or constituted by these drives, these faculties. The Sun is our very basic, the very core sense of identity. To some extent, Mars is similar. It also has to do with the idea of ego or identity, but it is not so much your center and your core as the Sun would represent. Sun in Vedic astrology is literally your soul, but Mars is more your identification with the objects of your desire and your will to get them, if you like, or to be gratified. So there's this self-assertion with Mars. The Moon is your very basic drives, your basic nurturing drives. For example, we take for granted that we have the instinct to eat. We take for granted that we have the instinct to herd to some degree with others of our kind and all of these things. These key instincts that relate to our basic sense of belonging, which is what the Moon represents, are very fundamental to our survival, and they operate at a pretty automatic and unconscious level. And the Moon represents a lot of these. The Moon represents many things, but this is certainly one of them. Also, in Vedic astrology, the Moon is said to rule the mind. And when Western astrologers hear that the Moon is the mind, they would tend to object and say that Mercury is the mind. The Moon is the mind in Vedic astrology in the sense of the Moon representing our very basic level of consciousness, our very basic sentience and awareness. And so it represents, some people even literally call it emotional mind, because it represents perception and awareness or consciousness at its most basic level, the basic capacity to receive impressions. So if you can understand it that way, it becomes easy to accept that the Moon is the mind, and then it becomes easy to understand also how the Moon would represent that basic awareness in us, where thoughts and feelings and moods are pretty indistinguishable from each other, whereas Mercury, the planet that is usually associated with the mind, that word mind, just a word really, in Vedic astrology, the Mercury is called Buddha and represents Buddhi, which is sometimes translated as discrimination and intellect as opposed to mind. So there's this analytical function that Mercury represents, which is not the same thing as the basic faculty of perception and basic mental awareness. So that Moon represents. So someone with a strong moon would be bright, so to speak, but and not necessarily illogical. There can be a certain very sound logical instinct, but Mercury, when Mercury is prominent, it's more likely to represent a particularly articulate quality, a particularly rational quality that is divorced from feeling, and can therefore look at even personal matters with a logical detachment. Of course, if you happen to have the Moon and Mercury powerfully connected in a birth chart, you might either have your ability to maintain a logical view of your emotions enhanced or diminished, depending on the aspect and so on. So I'm just sort of alluding to the fact that we can separate these things, but they then all tend to interact in many birth charts. But now we're talking about the fact that these 5 planets represent the basic personality. Venus represents, a little like the Moon, what I described earlier as that herding instinct. It's our friendliness. Yes, that's a simple way of putting it, but it represents our ability to engage with people. It's part of our communication instinct. You know, Mercury might represent communication in the sense of our ability to say the right words that are the correct ones, so to speak. But Venus is that instinct for friendship that actually enables us to get along with people and that makes us want to be with them. And Venus and Mars as 2 polar opposite principles also help to maintain this balance between the need to maintain our individual identity for the sake of our own survival, while at the same time giving us a desire to be part of something, a desire to be loved and liked. And in an ideal balance, it would mean that we're able to form and maintain friendships and relationships without losing our sense of independence. But, you know, some people might have a very strong Mars and a weak Venus, or vice versa, and then you get all kinds of different specific situations. But basically, these 5 planets, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus and Mars, constitute the core elements of our personality. Our sense of identity, which is the Sun, our communication, which is Mercury, our basic awareness and sentience, which is the Moon, and our sociability, for want of better words, which is Venus. And, you know, with Mars, our ability to assert ourselves and to win in this competitive world. You see, so when we get to Jupiter and Saturn, we're getting to Jupiter and Saturn, even in the solar system, are clearly a totally different category of planet. You know, there are these gaseous giants, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars are all, I think they're called terrestrial planets. They're all little solid, small planets. So, you know, what's interesting is that it is all of those little planets in the Sun and Moon that constitute these very basic elements of our being, that the ones we're constantly using in our day-to-day self-expression. When we get to Jupiter and Saturn, we start getting to a level of awareness or level of functioning that connects us to the larger social wholes that we're part of, to the larger community that we're part of, to the civilization, the nation, the culture that we're part of. And these 2 planets being so big in a way is an allusion to that. They represent the bigger picture, in a sense. They're the larger wholes that we're part of. But they too are opposite each other in their attributes. They are in themselves a type of polarity. And you can see that they actually are essentially have the same symbols that are just inversions of each other. You see, Jupiter is a crescent over a cross, and Saturn is a cross over a crescent. And the idea here is that this crescent represents the things that the moon represents, our sentience, that's rising above the limitations of matter represented by the cross, whereas Saturn, which is a planet that we know represents limitation and restriction and things like this, is the cross of matter over the crescent of the soul or the feelings or the sentience. Okay, so although Jupiter and Saturn represent these opposite principles, they don't have a very distinct gender polarity. It's not easy to say which one would be masculine or which one would be feminine. Saturn is kind of feminine in its withdrawn quality, whereas Jupiter is more expansive, therefore maybe more masculine. But Jupiter is more nurturing than Saturn is. Saturn's often associated with this idea of a sort of a stern father figure, but the fact is that Saturn, in my experience, will often represent elders of the same sex in particular, depending on what your sex is, because they are the ones that give us a sort of a template for our future stepping into our gender roles. But Saturn represents our social duties, so it's in that context that it represents literally the idea of the elders. But anyway, it's very important to understand that Jupiter and Saturn are in themselves a polarity of sorts, so that when they come into some sort of interaction with each other in a birth chart or in the context of cycles, you don't just have any two planets that are connecting. You have planets that are inherently complementary opposites. So Jupiter, for example, is the idealism and the aspiration to grow in awareness that finds its expression on a social collective level as religion and philosophy, as the products of this desire for greater and fuller awareness, greater knowledge in the fullest and most comprehensive sense of the word. And from this religion and philosophy phenomena or manifestation in society, we also get law, and we get ethical codes. And generally, this aspiration also leads to an awareness of I would say the need to nurture people, both through things like education, which in a sense nurtures culture, which is something that Jupiter represents, but also through things like hospitals and caregiving. So Jupiter, like I said earlier, is kind of nurturing. One of the products of this expansive seeking or aspiration is a tendency to emerge with a strong philanthropic and generous impulse, whereas Saturn tends to be conspicuous in its absence of this fellow feeling for others, and this nurturing. Saturn represents what is practical and real without any regard for what is nice and good. So Saturn represents things that are very practical. Saturn is just about cold facts. And of course there's a virtue in that, because being able to look at things in a pragmatic, practical way can make one practical, can help one to get things done, and can help one to be efficient with the mechanics involved in and the logistics involved in real world stuff. But when you blend Jupiter and Saturn effectively, you get a situation where the material structures are available for the idealistic philanthropic work of Jupiter. So I don't want to waffle on about this, but there's a lot to be learned from meditating, in a sense, on the ways in which Jupiter and Saturn can complement each other. And this is why there is this traditional notion that prophets are born under Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, which occur every 20 years. It is because when these planets are brought together, you can have a very practical implementation of some sort of ideal. And that type of practical implementation of an ideal is one way in which certain social institutions get maintained decade after decade or generation after generation. And the people who've got strong Jupiter-Saturn combinations in their charts often find themselves called upon to be the agents of, or the custodians rather, for these traditions. Then finally we have another classification of the planets, which is the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And in modern astrology, there's a lot more of these than you see there. You know, Pluto a while ago was relegated to the status of being, I think it's called one of the trans-Neptunians. In other words, the other planets somewhat like Pluto out there beyond Neptune that are also small like Pluto, if I'm not mistaken. And they for some reason, their status is not that of fully fledged planet, but as a sort of a class of little bodies out there. But these are the main ones to know about for now: Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And you know, these planets are all out in the solar system beyond Saturn, and Saturn in itself represents a type of boundary. You know, it's like the real world we know about. The concrete realities, in a way, it kind of ends there. And these planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, tend to represent things that are a bit out there, so to speak. These outer planets are, you know, tend to be or represent things that are kind of outside of the concern of day-to-day life. So when people are very powerfully tuned into these outer planets, they might often be social mavericks of sorts, so to speak, or you know, like social, not necessarily misfits, but they're people who have a unique role beyond the sort of householding, I suppose, that occupies most people's attention. So we'll go into each of these planets later. But one of the things to note about the outer planets as a group is that they're kind of impersonal, and they move very slowly through the zodiac. You know, as the planets move out into the solar system, as we, you know, the further planets are out into the solar system, the more slowly they orbit the sun. So these planets will remain in one sign for several years, and therefore you will share the same sign position of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in your chart with many people born within even the same decade as yourself, roughly. It's a little different with each one. So in this sense, the outer planets are often described as generational influences. But when and if these outer planets become connected to personal planets in your chart, particularly the sun and moon, or perhaps also the ascendant, then you as an individual might then be a lot more likely to embody the attributes of an outer planet. But by themselves, without connecting to some inner planets in your chart, they remain relatively transpersonal. They relate to the backdrop of the generation you're born into. All right, so let's go briefly through the planets. And you know, these keywords and these basic associations with the planets that we'll look at now, this will be very familiar to you if you've already looked at astrology. But the thing is, if you haven't gone into astrology before, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to start building these associations with the planets. But even if you have then spent some time going through them, or rather working with the planets, it can always be interesting to revisit them in this basic way, because your understanding of these basic factors never stops developing in its sort of subtlety, I guess. You know, the sun being the focal point in the whole solar system is obviously very important, and if not obviously the most important heavenly body. And it's true that therefore the sun is the king, is the father, is the boss, power, authority. You know, it represents all those ideas. In Vedic astrology, the sun is called the Atma Karaka, the significator of the soul. That's very significant because the idea there is that it represents the self in its most essential form. In both Western and Vedic astrology, the sun, the moon, and the ascendant are the three most important points in the chart. But in practice, they would treat the sun as the least important of those three most important. Now, the reason for that is that the sun is the soul, the moon is the mind, and the ascendant is the body. So although what you are in essence is a soul, although that is the most fundamental truth of your being, although if you say, here I am, the most essentially fundamentally true place to point is to your sun, so to speak, to your soul. But while we are embodied, while we have bodies, we tend to be far more interested in and preoccupied with our physical bodies and our feelings and thoughts. In other words, our ascendants and our moons. So our sun is very, very important, but we're sometimes more preoccupied with ascendant and moon issues. Now, the sun, when it's strong in a chart, it gives a person a strong sense of confidence and dignity. Okay, this confidence, dignity, leadership, and pride, these qualities are very much the expressions of a healthy sun. The sort of regal quality of the sun, you know, the sun rules the sign Leo. These leonine regal qualities of the sun manifest in us as a sense of pride in who we are. So that also gives us a healthy dose of ambition. When you feel that you are a lion amongst the beasts in this world, then it would not be fitting for you to underachieve, and so you would be naturally sort of goaded to, spurred on to achieve things simply in order to be able to take your rightful place amongst people as one of the leaders, if you like. So sometimes when the sun is weak, people will lack that self-respect, so they might not really work hard to achieve things. They might not care so much about their achievements, or sometimes when the sun is very weak, there can be a sort of an overcompensation for a sense of inadequacy. So a healthy sun causes a person to want to achieve things from a healthy level of ambition, and then it really then becomes a maladjusted issue. A weak sun Like if the sun is in the sign Libra in Vedic astrology, or there's certain other conditions in which the sun can be hampered, can cause a person to be insecure, but then needing to assert their ego somehow, often in a slightly inappropriate way or in an ill-timed way. So obviously there's a natural question of, when I talk about what is a strong sun or a weak sun, or when I refer to strong suns and weak suns and so on, there are a lot of different criteria or astrological rules whereby you would deduce that. And I know I'm being a little bit general here, not giving sort of a very detailed list of examples of how that works. For now, I'm going to suggest you take it just as a symbolic sort of concept. Precisely because there are so many different technical considerations for assessing whether or not there's a weak, strong sun. And as you grow in your astrological knowledge, your ability to discern that will become better. If a person had to study the planets, a little like we're doing now, and come to a strong level of connection with these ideas, then if you met somebody using these ideas, you could tell whether or not they had a strong sun, regardless of whether or not you had their chart in front of you. In other words, this is in itself, like I was referring to earlier, an example of a type of model of the constitution of a human being on more than just a physical level. So the sun principle, or the sun faculty, has a lot to do with our personal power. And therefore, ideas like vitality, will, leadership, these things come into it in terms of the themes associated with the sun. Very importantly, the sun completes the cycle through the 12 signs of the zodiac in 1 year. So the Earth-Sun relationship, the Earth-Sun cycle, is what we base that unit of time we call a year on. And as I said earlier, the 360 degrees in a circle are based on the number of days in a year. Many of the ancient calendars had 360-day years, which they then adjusted. Just like we have a leap year every 4 years where we add a day, they had other more crude means of bringing the calendar back into alignment every other year. So we find that the sun moves 1 degree per day, and that becomes quite a useful, simple fact when we need to do more calculations later on. All right, so the moon is the queen, the mother, represents women in general, represents caring and nurturing. We did touch on this earlier. It's the emotional life, all of that sort of thing. We know the moon is associated with the home and family in the past. But the interesting thing about the moon being associated with the home is that when something is affecting the moon in a birth chart, or when certain cycles are affecting a person's moon, you can see it manifested or reflected in what happens in the person's home physically. So it can be that there can be things like plumbing problems, for example, but it can also be that just like if you have a Uranus moon influence, you might find that you often have unexpected people arriving in your house, and so everything you're experiencing in your home tends to be reflected in the moon. And the reason I'm honing in on this a little is because people often don't realize how what they do in their home and the way they create and manifest it, and conduct themselves in their home is this type of precise reflection of where they are at on an emotional level. And if you had to then take it upon yourself to work with creating home in a very conscious way, you will also be transforming very basic part of yourself on a psychological level. I mentioned earlier that the moon is associated with instinctive reactions, or the instinctive drives that help us to survive. So in that sense, the moon is also our unconscious. There's a lot of stuff beneath the surface of what drives us, if you know what I mean. We experience various joys and sorrows in our lives, and without realizing it, these past events that we might even have forgotten have contributed a lot towards our attractions and aversions and so on. And so the moon is very important in this respect. When the moon is in a good state in a chart, when the moon is quite strong, people have a good, strong sense of belonging somewhere. Their family roots are quite good. They manage to give and receive nurture without any inhibition. When the moon is in a problematic state, if there are many planets that are aspecting the moon in a difficult way, like if Mars or Saturn are aspecting the moon, or if the moon is in the 8th house or something like that, then people have a wound in the moon, in the basic emotional life, and that can create an underlying turbulence and tension in the let's call it the underlying mood, that can have quite a negative effect on a person's ability to go out and make life work, both on a personal level and on a professional level. That, let's call it irritability or difficulty getting on with people or what have you, or self-image issues, can cause behaviors that then often are throwing a little bit of a spanner in the wheel, so to speak, which happens less often when people have a happy moon. You might have seen in the previous slide relating to the sun that the sun is literally associated with the fire element. And in Ayurveda, which is Indian holistic healing, you have these 3 constitutional types, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. It's a little like the 4 humas used in traditional Western medicine and astrology. But many people who are not studying Vedic astrology are interested in Ayurveda, so it's not a bad thing to look at that a little here. Pitta is the fire constitutional type, and if you haven't yet checked your own Ayurvedic constitutional type, it might not be a bad thing to do that. There's lots of questionnaires you can do it with online. But the sun would produce Pitta conditions, conditions that relate to overheating, redness, rash, bleeding, I don't know, all these kinds of conditions where the moon is more soothing. It's water, it's cool, it's more kapha, which is a much more steady element. The kapha is often associated with earth, but it's like a earth watery state. Now, important to note that the moon completes a cycle through the zodiac signs every 28 days. The word month comes from moon. A month is a moonth. So we know this. We know that the moon has a 28-day cycle. Well, it's not only through the zodiac, but also then it's closer to 29 days. The sun-moon cycle, the cycle of new moons and full moons. And the measurement of time we know as a week is basically a quarter of a lunar cycle. That's why the 28 days of a lunar cycle are divided into 4 7-day parts And those, each of those 7 weekdays are then also ruled by the planets. Sunday, Sun's Day, Monday's Moon Day, Tuesday's Mars Day, Wednesday's Mercury Day, and so on. Okay, so Mercury is, like I've said already, it's a child, and it's the planet most associated with intellect, not basic consciousness and mental awareness, which is what the moon represents, but analysis. Okay, so Mercury is about anything that relates to detail with, Mercury is a very important planet if you're going to be a leader, because if you aren't able to articulate what you want from people, if you aren't able to communicate in precise, clear terms, you can't lead. So I mention this just because people might sometimes underestimate the importance of Mercury and the importance of how, not only how we, whether or not we have a strong Mercury in the hand we were dealt in our birth chart, but also whether we're using whatever Mercury we've been given to its maximum potential. So Mercury's got a lot to do with our ability to develop skill. It's difficult to be skillful without Mercury. It's difficult to do astrology without Mercury, because Mercury involves all calculation. So literacy is basically what Mercury represents. Now, Mercury is the closest planet to the Sun. So from our perspective, Mercury is never far from the Sun. Mercury can never be more than 1 sign away from the Sun. So on average, Mercury cycle through the zodiac is pretty similar to the Sun, about a year. Now Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, it's associated with relationships and romance and all of that. Very simple in a way, but and Venus is our sense of fulfillment. It's when us and other people are in harmony, and also when we're in harmony with our environment, when we're feeling comfortable, when our chair is soft, when our juice is sweet, when our view is beautiful. It's when we're able to experience a sense of compatibility with an external thing. And on perhaps a slightly deeper level, we can see that Venus represents not only the idea of relationships that we might have with other human beings, and like marriage and all of that, and the attractions and aversions that are associated with that dance. On maybe a more on the level of consciousness, in a sense, Venus can also represent our ability to see things as related or as whole. If you're feeling very harmonious, very inwardly at peace, when you feel as if the different elements of the world are all in good proportion with each other and with you, it in a sense helps you to see things more clearly than you otherwise would. So I'm really trying to communicate here that there is sort of a deeper intelligence, maybe for want of a better word, to Venus, beyond the sort of Barbie doll archetype that Venus is sometimes stuck with, and that certainly doesn't represent the alpha and omega of what Venus really means. Now, Venus is just a little bit further out from the Sun than Mercury. So like Mercury, Venus also has a very similar cycle to the Sun. and Venus is never more than 2 signs from the sun. Venus is never more than about, I think it's 48 degrees from the sun, whereas Mercury is never more than 28 degrees from the sun. So Venus can only be in the same sign as your sun sign, or in 2 signs on either side of your sun sign, due to the fact that it's fairly close to the sun in the solar system. Okay, so Mars, you have the opposite principle of Venus. We've already said a bit about Mars and about the fact that it represents that it's our competitiveness with which we manage to make our way in our environment, to fulfill our short-term desires, to compete. And so we need courage and daring to do that successfully. So Mars in our charts will represent our ability to do that, and when Mars is present in a healthy dose, it gives us confidence, and we manage to strike while the iron is hot, so to speak. We manage to take initiative, and it gives us the energy. A weak Mars can indicate cowardice, indecisiveness, things like this. Generally, when Mars comes into focus cyclically, there are certainly great potentials then for us to achieve things, because Mars is this raw, fiery energy with which we can get things done. It energizes things. So it certainly is the enemy of apathy. But there's always the danger with Mars that its excitability can result in conflict. Mars isn't tactful, and therefore it is tactless, and therefore Mars does represent arguing and conflict. You know, Jupiter is the biggest planet in the solar system, and it's interesting that in both Western and Vedic mythology, Jupiter is connected with the idea of the sort of king of the gods. So Jupiter, in some respects, rivals the Sun, and Jupiter is, according to many, a type of forming sun. So there's certainly some overlap there. But with Jupiter, you don't have this emphasis so much on the idea of ego, I guess, and personal power. There's a stronger emphasis on the idea of awareness and a wisdom that comes not only from cultivating knowledge through teachers or literature, but through experience. So Jupiter and Saturn, like I said earlier, are the elders, you know, and it's they're wise planets because of that. They've got the experience to kind of know how things work. So they tend to look at things from a bigger, more impersonal perspective than the inner planets. Although they're not quite as impersonal as the outer planets, they are in their own way outer planets of sorts, and as such, somewhat impersonal. So Jupiter also helps us to have a vision. Jupiter in your chart is your vision of fulfillment, whatever that could mean for you. Jupiter on the most personal level represents the fulfillment of our hopes, our vision of what a life of success means. For some people, that might be nothing more than having a nice home, nice food, nice wife or husband or whatever. And then Jupiter can represent that. And if you're blessed with sufficient Jupiter influence, then You might get those things, but at its highest, Jupiter would represent our awareness that our fulfillment is part of, connected to abstract principles of truth in the form of religion and philosophy. To the extent that we align ourselves with those, to that extent can we achieve realization and fulfillment in our personal lives. So Jupiter is really about success, and therefore, though I use that word in the broadest sense. Jupiter completes a cycle through all 12 signs of the zodiac in 12 years, and therefore passes through one sign in 1 year. It's an interesting thing, that it has this peculiar link there also again with the sun. That Jupiter takes 1 year, which is a solar cycle, to complete 1/12 of its cycle. Okay. Saturn. The more I look at astrology, the more, on the one hand, I recognize Saturn as a planet that can produce very serious difficulties in a person's life, and you should never underestimate that. Saturn has a fairly well-earned and justified reputation as a planet of obstruction and sorrow and things like this. But Saturn also very often creates conditions that are absolutely indispensable to getting many good things to happen. Sometimes even, for example, in the context of relationship compatibility, without some Saturn, it's very hard for a relationship to actually solidify enough for you to build a life with someone. And it is true that the Saturn influence that will be there will have a dampening effect on the vivaciousness, that is between two people, for example. But at the same time, Saturn will give that emphasis on structure and duty that keeps the thing together. You see, without that, things fall apart somewhat. Saturn is the skin and bones. In a sense, they're both structural, defining organs. So Saturn has that purpose in our lives. It gives form to things, and in that sense, sometimes when it's aligned with something like Jupiter, it can help to give form to our ideals, help us to give form to our aspirations. But very often, even in that context, it depends to a large degree on our ability to accept certain limitations. And Saturn does represent that. So I've also noticed, though, that Saturn tends to be a lot harder on people who've been, in a way, living a little too wildly. So Saturn is, in a way, God's grandfatherly spirit. Jupiter is his, jovial soul. So Saturn, or Kronos, is literally traditionally the god of time, and this idea of mortality then also being linked to time, the idea that there's a defined limit to everything and that things do eventually end, makes good sense. The fact that Saturn's day, should be the Sabbath day, the proper Sabbath day, would also make sense. And even in the Bible, when God had been making the world for a whole 6 days, he had to stop and rest on the seventh. It's Saturn. So Saturn represents something very important. It Saturn's the reality check planet. But if we learn to work with the boundaries and the limits that Saturn tries to teach us about and make us aware of, then Saturn rewards us with making things very real. By contrast, Uranus is very much unlike Saturn. Uranus represents freedom. Instead of representing limits and structures, Uranus represents, if anything, defiance of all of those things that are Saturnine. It's almost like Uranus is this wild animal that broke out of the Saturnine cage in the solar system and went exploring, so to speak, because Uranus is very much a planet of innovation, of pioneering, and so Uranus represents what is new, but Uranus is not preoccupied particularly with structure and with permanence. Uranus, according to Robert Hand, is, although it is in modern Western astrology connected to the sign Aquarius, Robert Hand says it's really a fiery planet, and I would agree with that. It has this very high energy, high voltage quality to it, and so it brings about manifestation of things in a very sudden way. Uranus really awakens anything. If Uranus touches anything, it brings it to a very rapid speed of expression, very rapid rate of vibration. So Uranus is very much a live wire, and when Uranus manifests abruptly in our lives, it manifests through things happening in a shocking way. But more often than not, Uranus is ultimately benign in the sense that it shakes us up when we've been getting stale. It ensures that we do not remain unharassed perpetually, which could otherwise have allowed us to become very set in our ways. So change, and change that tends to come pretty suddenly and dramatically, is very much what Uranus represents. So that kind of thing can help us to look at things from new angles. So Uranus loves the unorthodox angle. If Venus connects with Uranus, it wants to have homosexual or interracial or otherwise socially unusual relationships, for example. Uranus always wants to do things differently. Jupiter, Uranus always wants to look at philosophy or religion from the most radical possible angle. Now, although Uranus can be a little perverse in its determination to always be different, sometimes by being open to looking at things from these unique angles, there are, brilliant revelations and innovations that can come from it. So Uranus can make your life freer and show you lots of previously unsuspected possibilities. We all often assume that we're far more limited than we really are. Neptune is far more passive than Uranus is. It's almost the opposite of Uranus in that sense. If Uranus is something that shocks you and wakes you up, Neptune is something that drugs you and gets you into some fantasy land. So Neptune is very elusive, relatively subtle actually. There are certain types of Neptune influence that can occur in a chart, specifically when involved in less powerful types of aspects, like let's say a sextile or something like this. There's some such Neptune influences that can remain almost undetected or unrecognized, partly because it operates at a relatively subtle and also relatively emotional sort of level. So with some of the subtler Neptune influences, one has to be fairly quiet and peaceful in order to recognize the effect or the significance or reality or presence of that influence. When Neptune comes into a very powerful manifestation in our life, we can become disorientated, because Neptune, if Saturn gives things very precise boundaries and limits, Neptune makes the entire universe one vast, limitless mass of infinite possibilities. If Mercury helps to make the attributes of particular things very specific and clear, Neptune blurs them completely. So Neptune dissolves everything that would normally give us a sense of being clear about who we are, where we are, and what we're doing and why. And yet, by doing so, Neptune can also help us to, in a sense, perceive a vast underlying unity, or to experience a vast underlying unity in the universe beyond what is possible when you're preoccupied with the little names and forms of things. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but there's a lot of universality to Neptune. But precisely because it expands the range of the lens, so to speak, it can throw perception into chaos. I guess it's not unlike having some sort of microscope that you suddenly then start aiming at the stars. The focus is all out, and it's actually just chaos what you get. So Neptune can be very confusing. Neptune, in a sense, represents our desire to surrender, like a little droplet, to dissolve into the vast ocean that we're part of. So there's the strong desire for some self-transcendence of sorts to happen through Neptune. Sometimes you can understand a planet by understanding what it's not. One thing Neptune is definitely not is the solar ego, so to speak, or the Martian ego. Neptune is very opposite to that. Neptune doesn't have ego. Because it doesn't have a very specific location. Mercury and Neptune are also very opposite. Mercury is not logical. Neptune is not logical as Mercury is. So Neptune will feel things, not rationalize them. Neptune is a little bit like Venus. Sometimes people even say that Neptune is the higher octave of Venus, in the sense that this sense of connectedness and relatedness is something that corresponds. They're not exactly the same thing, but there's a closer fit there. Jupiter and Neptune might be quite similar because they're both idealistic, but Neptune just takes that spiritual quality that Jupiter might be associated with and almost amplifies it to the level of the mystical. So at its best, Neptune makes for a type of universality in perception and vivid imagination. At worst, it creates confusion and a type of martyrdom and victimization. Neptune is supremely impractical. All right, now Pluto is, as far as I know, actually slightly smaller than Mercury. So this is an example of the old saying that you have strong poison in small bottles, sort of thing. Pluto is very potent. Pluto represents energies that are very primal, very raw. So Pluto's, like the sun, Pluto can represent power, but it doesn't represent that regal, formal, openly wielded power. Pluto is a more primal, raw underworld power. so to speak. And it also represents in our own characters, in terms of our own drive for power, it represents something a lot more primal than the sun would represent. It doesn't represent our dignity as the sun would represent. It represents those primal power instincts that might express themselves through sexuality to some degree, perhaps also through other competitive behaviors that are expressed more subtly but still very powerfully in a social context. You know, when people feel threatened and then respond in turn rather with being threatening or manipulative and coercive, that's a very Plutonian sort of process. Now, Pluto being the most distant planet in the solar system that we generally use, it moves more slowly through the zodiac than any of the other planets, and therefore this idea that it would represent something transpersonal, as all the outer planets do, this idea is even more true of Pluto to some degree than the others. So Pluto seems to also have this very distinct tendency to be connected to larger social processes. So when Pluto comes into strong personal focus, it might often lead us to want to wield power for the purpose of achieving some sort of social transformation. There's often this idea of directing the power of a group or the masses in some way when Pluto's energy is involved. And that can be very empowering, but it can also bring about dramatic disempowerment, so to speak. What I mean is somebody who abuses the collective energy available in a group or society could also then find themselves then on the wrong end of it. An example might be like people involved in crime, sometimes have that experience where they ultimately then become by wielding power in an abusive way, they ultimately become victims of the sort of justice or the will of the larger group. You know, so Pluto can be quite brutal, and there's also the tendency with Pluto to become very intense about things. You know, whatever Pluto touches becomes something more compelling. And sometimes this is a very good thing, because Pluto can help us to, like for example, if it connects with Venus, can make a relationship fascinating, can absorb us deeply into it. This might be good and might not be good. It's not that it's good or bad in and of itself. It's just that the results may or may not be positive. You can do things very thoroughly if you're very fascinated with them, but there's also the danger of fanaticism, you know, and obsessive preoccupation with something that can happen with Pluto. So Pluto is a very interesting planet that can help us to breathe new life into things through commitment, but it does often though require, you know, if we get sidetracked with it, so to speak, we often do have to confront forces outside ourselves that can be very compelling. So people with a very positive and healthy sense of purpose tend to have a better time with Pluto. Okay, now we've kind of looked at all the planets now, the planets proper. I'll touch here briefly on the moon's nodes, even though we're not really going to use them, but you'll see them in charts, and therefore, you know, it creates some confusion if you see these things and you don't know what they are. You can see here in this example chart of Einstein's, which we looked at earlier, you can see there is the node. The north node is marked there as being at 1 degree Aquarius. Now, what isn't shown there is that the south node will be 1 degree of Leo. And the symbol for the south node is always just an inversion of the north node. So because the south node is always the exact opposite sign and degree to the north node, often the south node is not drawn in charts because it is something you can deduce. Now, regarding the astronomy of what the nodes are, this diagram hopefully will help you get a sense of it. You see this yellow circle represents the sun's path. You see here we are on Earth in the center, so we're looking out towards the sun and moon. And so we've got the sun's path in yellow, and the sort of blue-gray path is the moon. Okay, and they're tilted at this 5 degree angle you can see there in relation to each other, and therefore there are these 2 points that are directly opposite each other where these orbital paths intersect. And these are the north and south nodes. So the nodes are not actual physical things. They're not actual planets. There are these abstract points, in a sense, these intersection points of the orbital paths of the sun and moon. But when because of this intersecting of the orbital paths, when you have a new moon or full moon, in other words, a sun-moon conjunction or sun-moon opposition occurring on that axis, you have an eclipse, because that is when either the moon will be in front of the sun, or the Earth's shadow covers the moon. Or, sorry, I think that's the Earth's shadow covering the sun. So basically, the moon's nodes are associated with, mythologically, the north node. This is the symbol for the north node. Looks a little bit like Leo. Traditionally, the north node is called the dragon's head, and the south node the dragon's tail. And there's this idea of a dragon is interesting in Vedic astrology. I won't go into the long version of this, but the gods and the demons were busy churning the cosmic ocean to get a certain elixir from it, and there was a certain dragon of sorts that stole this elixir, and the sun and moon, which represent the eyes, the lights, saw what was happening and alerted Vishnu, who then sliced this being in half with the discus. So these 2 separated halves of this one being were were cast into the sky, and they always go retrograde, they always go backwards along the zodiac, and they are perpetually hunting the sun and moon. And this dragon swallows the sun and moon at eclipses. So from one perspective, especially in Vedic astrology, the nodes are considered as problematic planets because they're, well, they're called planets, although they aren't planets in the usual sense of the term, because they have this eclipsing desire, this desire to swallow up the sun and moon, and they have their effect in generally wherever they are. But in Western astrology, there are other views on what they mean. It's actually one of the most complicated and somewhat ambiguous areas of, or specific symbols in astrology, and yet they're quite important. I've come to the conclusion that they work in more than one way, and that there's more than one of these different theories that are actually true. Some people associate the nodes very much with the idea of connecting with other people, our bonds with groups, or other relationships, not necessarily romantic relationships, not necessarily family relationships, but our associations with others. For example, Mercury combining with node could mean an intellectual group, for example, or something like that. A discussion group, a book club, something like that. But then there are other views that indicate that the North Node represents where you need to be orientating towards for growth, and the South Node represents a type of comfort zone you need to pull yourself out of. There are many views. Again, we won't really be using the nodes much. I'm just introducing you to them. You see them in charts. In Vedic astrology, I use them a lot more, and I use them also in a slightly more advanced application of the basics we'll be studying when we look at midpoints, when it comes to midpoints in Western astrology, which is like an extension of aspects. All right, I'm seeing that we're pretty much now at the end of this first session, the time allotted for it. So I'm going to leave it there, because the next thing we were going to start looking at now, or the next step from here, is a look at the zodiac and the structure of the zodiac, which will then lead us to looking at aspects, the geometric angles that we use the zodiac to calculate. And once we've gotten through that, we're going to get to, I suppose, the juicy stuff, so to speak, looking at actually how to identify important things in a birth chart, and how to interpret them. And then beyond that, we'll be looking at how we apply this to life cycles. So we have 3 more sessions to achieve that in. I think we'll have enough time to get fairly far with it. Okay. I hope this has been relatively clear as far as it's gone. Be patient with the process. The more interesting stuff comes further down the line.